Welcome, everyone. I'm here today with Gregg Behr. Gregg is the director of the Grable Foundation. He's founder and co-chair of Remake Learning and co-author of When You Wonder, You're Learning, which will be released later this month in April. His goal is to remake learning across America for each and every kid. So welcome, Gregg. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
So I'd love to start by hearing your vision of remaking learning. So you want to remake learning for every kid in America. So where are we now, and what's your vision of where we should go?
Yeah, well, so let's start with Pittsburgh, where I'm located, because our goal is right here in southwestern Pennsylvania. And if it has ramifications across the country, then that's an outstanding opportunity. So I start right here at home. And for me, this is work that began about 15 years ago, and beginning to realize as I talked with teachers and librarians and youth workers that in fact something seismic was happening in kids' lives. Now, I didn't appreciate then the whole field of the learning sciences, and it feels a little naive in 2021 to go back to 2006 and talk about it this way. But what we learned then was that in fact kids were consuming information differently, producing information differently, developing their identities differently, seeking affirmation differently. And in fact, neuroscience and cognitive science has borne out over these past 15 years that in fact, kids are developing differently. So the bets that we started to make 15 years ago in this learning landscape in southwestern Pennsylvania was, if in fact something is seismically happening in kids' lives, how do we have to rethink instruction, design of learning spaces, the experiences kids have not only in schools, but in summer camps or at the library, online at home, and what is it that we can do to support the caring adults throughout kids' lives to a new learning landscape? And so that is the work of what is known locally as Remake Learning. So Remake Learning is a network of more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, creative industries, campuses of higher education that collectively in our region are thinking about what does it mean to advance learning that's relevant, that's engaging, and that's equitable. And that simple shift of moving from education and schooling to a sense of learning, that we all learn anywhere, anytime, at any place. And how can we support learners in genuine learning pathways in the places where they live? So we start to think about our places as campuses for learning. And so that's the work that we've tried to do here in this region. And in fact, every spring now, there's a regional celebration called Remake Learning Days, which is designed to engage parents, families, and caregivers, and helping parents understand how learning is being remade, why it's being remade, if their kid is in fact lit up by STEM or arts-based maker learning or technology-enhanced learning, how to support him or her in a learning pathway and what that looks like, and then to begin to demand changes in schools and museums and libraries that are commensurate with that. And I mentioned Remake Learning Days because that's the work that has taken root outside of southwestern Pennsylvania. So here in 2021, there are 17 places all across America that will be hosting Remake Learning Days across America, in the state of Oregon, in the county of San Diego in California, but also Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Ohio, Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky, and of course right here in southwestern Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia. And the whole idea is that we've got to find ways in school and out of school to capture what is timeless and classic about learning. For example, the caring relationships that are always going to be important and pivotal in a young person's trajectory, but matching that with what we know kids, what attracts kids, what ignites their passions and interests, and how to support them, having learned what we're learning about learning itself, and the ways in which we need to create different types of environments, use different types of tools and devices to support great learning. And it's that experimentation in developmentally appropriate ways that is the work of Remaking Learning.
Amazing. I have a few questions from there.
Yes, please.
But I also want to, at some point in the future, we should explore how we can do Remake Learning Days in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I am, and how we can connect and make that happen. Because I think we have really similar ideas on education. But you started out talking about how learning is different now and how kids are taking in information differently and processing information differently. And I'm really curious, kind of from a neuroscience standpoint and from a learning standpoint, differently from, I guess my first question was differently from what? Is it different from kids in the past? Is it different from the way adults learn? And what makes that different? Because that was really your initial, thought process of this seismic shift of education. So how, I guess the question is like, how is that different and different from whom?
So it's driven by social and technological changes. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but I read enough neuroscience to be dangerous. And even the brain mapping and brain scanning that neuroscientists have done are demonstrating how young kids' brains are lighting up differently in different ways than previous generations. So developmentally, young people are developing differently, but in that sociological way, we know that a kid might not only be in that classroom with the teacher, but might also be online and can produce something and can send it out to the world, to absolute strangers, and get affirmation from strangers in a way that you and I never did as kids, right? Our own experience was affirmation from our teachers, affirmation from our peers, affirmation from our families.
Mm-hmm.
Well, kids now can earn and receive good and negative affirmation in all sorts of places in a connected world. And in so, they're also experiencing the world differently, which is prompting them to develop their identities differently. You can be in the middle of Kansas and be anywhere in the world at any moment with access to almost any amount of information in a way that certainly none of us ever could be. And so, as we think about that, for adults, I'm sure it induces a deep anxiety, right? Like that's a little scary. At the same time, it opens up worlds. And so the challenge for us is to say, how do we take what's attractive to young people and make that constructive and good? And that's what so many of today's teachers are doing in classrooms as they think about, but also, as they think about how they integrate robotics and AI, but also traditional arts-based education and good project-based learning, which isn't new, but it's always made contemporary, right? But it's also what the designers and the artists and the technologists and the roboticists and the gamers and others are thinking about. And so, so much as we think about remaking learning and who today's kids are is understanding their perspective of things, how they're developing their identities and seeking affirmation differently, and how we can support them in the passions and interests that they have in a learning landscape that's entirely different than what you and I experienced.
Yeah, it is entirely different. And I think I'm in the same boat as you in that I've learned just enough neuroscience to be dangerous. And it's one of the things that I find both really exciting. Like I love your illustration of a kid sitting in Kansas and connected to the world, which that does make a lot of people really anxious. I find it really exciting as well that you can get those affirmations and you can reach out. Like you and I are having this conversation because of things that are possible now. But I'm also really curious and always curious about like how that changes child development and how that changes their brain and how that affects our social emotional learning and development as we look at it, literally lighting up different areas of the brain. And that's something we talked about because we talked about launching like a VR school and a VR program. But the idea of putting young kids into virtual reality for several hours a day to be in school, which in one hand seems like an amazing idea because you could be in school anywhere and be all together and gathered and learning. And you could be, you could be at home, you could be in any country, you could be in any space and all be together. But then that idea of what does that do for a child's brain development and what areas then are we developing and what areas are not developing because of that and what implications does that have are things that just make me really curious. And I don't have answers for it, but I find it interesting to hear that in your studies and in your looking at it, like you're literally seeing kids learning differently and excited by different things. And, what does that mean then for craftsmanship and the, crafting arts and man-made things versus technological and, all of those implications of that.
And for me, it opens up a world of curiosity and creativity, right? It invites
Yeah.
questions. I mean, really, how different is it from hundreds of years ago when the printing presses were invented, right? And it opened up a world of books, right? In some ways, the internet and all of the hardware and software we're creating are just the modern day printing presses. And the question is, how do we harness those for good? I think about, I have a great joy and privilege of being able to visit so many schools, so many libraries, so many early learning centers. And I think about visiting one classroom in the Duquesne city part of Pittsburgh. Duquesne is, well, it's seen better days. And most, if not all of those students receive free and reduced price lunches. I mean, it's a tough area in which to be, growing up. And going into one particular classroom, which is just, it's just lit up in the most project-based learning way that those of us who are lucky, 30, 40 years ago to experienced the 70s and 80s version of project-based learning. It's a modern version of that. And yet here the kids were learning about the Holocaust, right? And being able to put on VR glasses and, as they're doing their reading and having their seminar and having their conversation, learning things, being able to go from Duquesne, Pennsylvania to a very different place in Nazi Germany, many decades ago, and how then when they took off those devices, how that opened questions, it just opened questions because they had been transported physically to another place. And it just elucidated what they were otherwise reading in books and learning from films. And it just presented another opportunity. And to me, that was the great harnessing of technology in a constructive way. Again, that was developmentally appropriate, but that invited questions. And isn't that what great learning ultimately does? Is it invites questions, it acknowledges questions, it respects questions. It does all of those things for the learner because it loves the learner and puts the learner in the driver's seat.
Yeah, and by doing that, you're allowing, what we know about learning, you're changing that child's environment without actually changing their environment.
Yes.
But now, changing that environment and putting someone in a different physical state, a different emotional state, that's when that deeper learning really happens. And you have a deeper knowledge and greater understanding, so you can ask different questions. Yeah, that's a really optimistic use of technology.
I agree. Environment drives behavior. Bill Strickland here in Pittsburgh, who developed the Manchester Craftsman's Guild and whose work has been replicated around the world, in a very simple way, he says all the time, environment drives behavior. And it's that environment of the caring adults and how we conduct ourselves. Mm-hmm. It's the physical environment. It's the tools that we present to kids. It's that environment that drives behavior.
So let's dig a little more into that. And I know part of what you do with Remake Learning is to really develop learning ecosystems and creating this environment and network of authority figures, and you mentioned schools and museums and different people that come together to create a full ecosystem for students to learn. So can you talk more about what that system looks like in practice and how you draw people in and how educators make this happen for their classrooms?
So this has been 15 years of work of building a community, of building a different set of relationships among teachers, not only in a school building, but teachers across district boundaries, of teachers with museum exhibit directors, with librarians, of building a community that now consists of thousands of educators in and out of school, early childhood through high school, who are really experiencing learning differently. And that, again, that shift of education as being schooling to really thinking of our learning landscape differently in how we support kids. So it doesn't mean that it replaces school, right? School still has a critical role and probably always will have a critical role if we design it in the right ways for the future of where kids are. But we have to remember, kids spend only 14 to 20% of their waking hours in a school building. So all of those other waking hours, where are they? And how do we put together a high quality learning landscape that consists of amazing after school programs, of amazing early learning centers, of amazing online experiences, of family friendly opportunities for families to gather together. And so the work of Remake Learning, it consists of multiple things. One, there's just tremendous storytelling, right? About building a mindset in a region, a place like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or elsewhere, about what constitutes great learning, and celebrating the examples of things that are happening right in classrooms, that are happening in a library or an after-school program, and celebrating that and sharing that in a way that diffuses opportunity, diffuses innovation, and builds relationships too. And speaking of relationships, there's so much human organizing, right? So all sorts of meetups, virtual and in person, events, conferences, conference delegations, working groups, regional working groups around computational thinking or maker-centered learning or culturally responsive pedagogy, all sorts of working groups that allow professionals who regard themselves as educators, again, whether that's a teacher or an after-school director or an artist, right? Settings that allow educators to come together and to build relationship among one another and learn one another. I often say the work of Remake Learning isn't about the kids, it's about the adults, and repositioning us as adults to understanding who the kids are, building our knowledge of where the learning sciences are taking education and learning, and then building the relationships. So that if I'm a second grade teacher and I have a kid who is lit up by coding, maybe my school's been doing computational thinking, and we have some coursework that we've done in kindergarten and first grade and now second grade. And you can see when a kid is lit up by something, right? And when a kid is lit up by something, that's what enables him or her to soar. So if you have a kid that's suddenly lit up by coding, something maybe you and I didn't experience in school, or certainly didn't experience it in the way that we currently have, that you as an adult in Remake Learning now appreciate and understand that there is a web of relationships, organizations, experiences that I can share with that student's family to say, you know what, this is clearly lighting up this student. And here are 20 other opportunities in our community that we could start to think about building out a learning pathway. Now, we haven't gotten to the stage of massive credentialing or digital badging or formal educational passports. But so much of it is, moving in that direction where we really understand learning is happening well outside of the school building and is connected in the community. And we support those caring adults, whether it's that teacher or that parent, to support our kids, almost as if we give every single kid enrichment, right? It's no longer relegated just to gifted students, but we think about IEP like personalized, enriched learning experiences for kids, and we think about the ways in and out of school that we can provide that for kids.
Yeah, that's an amazing ecosystem. Like you answered my next question as I was thinking about it, is that like, how do you support the adults and how do you connect them and how do you build those relationships? But then hearing you talk about the students and, and coding and definitely things we didn't have. And I mean, to share a story, and it'll definitely date me, but my high school's first ever computer science class was invite only, and they invited 4 of us. And I was one of them that got to take computer science because my high school had 2 computers at the time. So they paired us up and each of us got, a pair of each of us got a computer, and we learned HyperCard. Which I don't know if you remember HyperCard, but it was it was the original, like you could create a page and a picture and a button, and then you'd push the button and it would go to the next page and there'd be a picture. Like it was essentially like a storybook that, our kindergartners create now within an ELA class period. It took us an entire semester to learn how to do this on our antiquated Apple IIe computers. But looking at, how you've built this ecosystem among adults, and then, I'm kind of picturing the next iteration of how do you create that individual learning system for that kid to really follow their interests and get the structure and the basics and, all of the skills that they really need, but also, weave this web for each individual student to follow their interests and have student-centered learning. And, we're not there yet. It doesn't sound like you're there yet, but I was picturing like this next. Yeah.
And I would say, there are a couple of ingredients I didn't mention, right? The ingredient of professional development, of professional learning. In the Remake Learning Network, in our region generally, there are dozens upon dozens of peer-led professional learning communities, where educators in and out of school can come together. some partner, for example, with Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, or they formed world-class partnerships with the Smithsonian Digital Learning Labs in Washington, D.C. Or it might be a local community of maker learning educators, but places where educators can connect, which is so critical as an educator because, sometimes you're lucky enough to walk down a hall and, maybe you have 5 colleagues right in that hallway who have that same sensibility of education and learning, and they have a similar pedagogical approach. But maybe you're the only one in your school building doing it too, right? Which is why network is so important, and a network that's supported, a place I can go where I'm connecting with like-minded educators and I'm attending to my craft and attending to my own opportunity, and there's space for me to be curious and there's space for me to experiment. And speaking of experimentation, in the Remake Learning Network, there are all sorts of grant opportunities, right? And allowing for lots of experimentation for, maybe I'm a teacher and I want to work with these technologists at this company because I have this idea of digital math blocks. But how would I do that and how would I create that? And creating just a lot of opportunities for adults to experiment together, right? The sort of experimentation and wonder that we want for kids in the classroom, giving that space for educators to do that. We have a grants program through Remake Learning right now called Moonshots, right? So as we think about a post-pandemic learning future, yes, there is all sorts of trauma to which we need to attend. There is all sorts of systemic racism or just other obvious challenges of accelerating learning that we need to address. I'm not discounting any of that. It's important to notice that, to tackle that head on. But we also need to give our self space to say, like, where do we want to be 2 years from now? We're going to emerge to a different place. And where do we want to stop tinkering and really make something dynamically new and make it normal in that new learning landscape on the other side of this pandemic? And so these moonshot grants are allowing folks across the network to connect. I was just on the phone earlier today with the superintendent who, was talking to agricultural experts in his community and the community college in his community. Clearly the grant opportunity had created this space where I'm going to reach out to these potential partners because I think we could do something special in this rural community in a different way. And I don't have money elsewhere in my life to be able to do this, but we could apply for this grant opportunity and maybe pursue that. And all along the way of 15 years, there have been lots and lots of small amounts, sometimes large amounts of catalytic grants that have allowed people to experiment. And again, when I say experiment, in developmentally appropriate ways, but allow them to support the time, space, the partnership with other colleagues to try some things and to do it differently in service to kids and learning. And that's so critical too, to give people the time and space to do that. And that's what something like a network allows.
Yeah, what a great opportunity for educators to be able to, take advantage of grant opportunities to create new things, and even just to work together and have the possibility of sharing their work with others and getting feedback and gaining that energy that you get from a network.
Yes.
That sounds phenomenal.
Well, it comes down to relationships. I mean, right?
Yeah.
We talk about learning, and again, there's some things timeless and classic for kids about those loving, caring adults who are present in your life. But that's true for us as adults too, right? Affirmation doesn't go away. The opportunity to partner doesn't go away. And so how do we create relationships that allow us as adults to do our work, to do it better, and to do it differently, and to learn?
Which leads me to one of my last questions. The title of your book is, When You Wonder, You're Learning. And we're talking about teachers having wonderings and creating learnings. But can you share, one or two of the key takeaways that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, so this is the new book, When You Wonder, You're Learning. So that's taken directly from lyrics of Fred Rogers, the iconic producer of children's television here in the United States, whose program originated right here in Pittsburgh.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Filmed for decades at WQED here in Pittsburgh, the nation's first public television station. And so, we think often about Fred Rogers around here. He's a local hero. I'm a Pittsburgh kid. I grew up watching Fred Rogers. And a number of years ago, I began to appreciate Fred Rogers not only as a loving, caring, grandfatherly person who was on my television, and whose show I enjoyed watching, but he's a learning scientist too. They certainly didn't use those words 50 years ago, but he was a remarkable learning scientist. And he's someone who studied in Pittsburgh at a time when you also had Margaret McFarland, Eric Erikson, Benjamin Spock, some giants of child development theory and practice of the 20th century. So he was steeped and grounded in child development, what we would now call it whole child development theory and practice. But Fred Rogers was also an innovator. He was a disruptor. He was radical, right? He was someone who said, what is the technology of my day? In his case, it was television. Mm-hmm. Understood that it was attractive to young people and said, this medium can be used differently and constructively to support learning. And so I mentioned Fred Rogers because we like to talk about the Fred method, that Fred method that connects what is timeless and classic with what is new and innovative and takes us to where we need to be given where today's young people are. And that's what Fred did 50 years ago. So this book is grounded in 6 different chapters, beginning with curiosity and then creativity and so on. Each chapter takes you back to an episode of Fred Rogers' Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right? So it's grounded in a story. And what we try and do, my co-author and I, Ryan Rydzeski, is elucidate then the contemporary learning science, right? Like how in 2021 we can think about the work that Fred did 50 years ago, and then give all sorts of modern examples in schools, in museums, in libraries, of ways that organizations are employing that Fred method with their own vision and their own expectations for themselves and for the kids in their care. And then gives really practical examples for teachers and parents about how we might take advantage of Fred's work. So many of us are talking these days about building back better, right? What does it mean to build back better as we think about a post-pandemic learning future? Well, we believe that part of building back better is looking at the blueprints of Fred Rogers, because essentially Fred Rogers left us a blueprint 50 years ago that shouldn't be left in the dustbin of history, but is incredibly relevant for 2021 and beyond. And there's so much about his work that could guide us as we look forward. And again, employing that Fred method in the ways that you and I and everyone else can do, and do it in smart ways on behalf of today's kids and what their futures hold.
I can't wait to read the book.
It's just, well, thank you. The way people talk about innovation as oftentimes finding something new and something familiar. In a sense, that's what we try and do in this book, right? Finding something new and relevant and future facing in something as familiar as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it was personally and professionally powerful for me to be part of writing this book. And I think it's forever changed me as a parent, as a dad. It's forever changed me as someone who's engaged in education and learning and endeavoring to support the amazing educators here in Southwestern Pennsylvania and beyond.
Yeah, I think we also, as we looked into innovation, as we look into post-pandemic education, we also have kind of this, I'm going to call it a sweet spot of crisis, and the crisis of distance learning and the crisis of the pandemic that we're coming out of, matched with this opportunity that we have to redesign things, to build back better, to recreate our learning atmosphere, because we've been away for so long. And it's caused so many of us to question, what is important? What are we learning? What do we bring back into the building, and how do we make it better when we go back? So it's very timely.
Yeah, this pandemic experience has been halting for all of us, right? And we should be sober to the obvious reality that 2019 was not working in so many ways for our kids, especially our Black and Brown learners, right? This pandemic has put an incredible spotlight on inequities. It's put an incredible spotlight on the systemic practices that we had in place that were really holding us back. And so what I get so excited and hopeful about, as I have the privilege and opportunity of meeting and working with superintendents and principals and teachers and librarians and museum directors and beyond, is the ways in which they are incredibly attentive to what it is that we need to do going forward. right? And what were the things that we were sort of tinkering with that we really are going to make normal, in the ways that we can? And how are we going to really take on some of the hard questions of our day and seriously, genuinely, and authentically try and address them? And it is such a privilege to work in the field of learning, and which leads me to another point that I feel it's so important to say, right? As we think about the future of learning, I myself have gotten stuck in the narrative like, oh, schools in particular, schools are stuck in a 20th century model. Well, another reality of this past year is that you'd be hard pressed to find another profession other than the educator profession that has been as deft, has been as flexible, has been as creative, has been as innovative as has the teaching field, right? And that wasn't only true about this past year. Teachers have been among the most innovative profession for decades. And yes, maybe the systems didn't allow them to accomplish the things that they wanted, but as a field, there is no other field that attends to its craft as much as does the teaching field, and that cares about what it does as much as the teaching field. And it's that care, that love, that attention to craft that has also, for me, been a bright spot of this past year, and should be so motivating to all of us who are either educators or allies to educators as we look into our future.
Yeah, what an incredible perspective. I hear so much and see so much on the internet about how so many things are wrong with schools, and schools have handled it poorly, and also see a lot of people really propping up the educators. But you're right, our teachers and our educators are some of the most creative and most flexible, and frankly, fastest to pivot during this time. I know personally, we shut down and we had 2 days to move from here's our entire learning plan for in school to here's our entire learning plan for distance learning, for the next however many months. And to be able to move, an entire staff and entire school districts and hundreds of thousands of people to completely shift the way that they do everything has been phenomenal.
It is phenomenal. And to do that on top of a reality when it wasn't clear, like, when is this going to end? Right? Some emergencies, like,
it's still not clear.
Right? Like, sometimes they're beginning, like, you can say, like, okay, we need to get to here, but like, this was in the context of a long emergency that was so uncertain, and that, has taken left and right turns. It's even more incredible when you consider those circumstances.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for all of your time today. I'd love to hear you share how our listeners can get in touch with you, or if you have any social media or things that you'd like to have them reach out.
I appreciate that. So a number of places. RemakeLearning.org is a place to connect to Remake Learning. RemakeLearningDays.org is a place to connect to the Remake Learning Days team. I'm mostly in social media on Twitter. So my handle is @Gregg Behr. That's GreggBehr. And that's probably the easiest place to connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed our conversation, and thanks again for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a real honor to be here. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Gregg.